you come into a liturgical service, the first thing you notice is that as the service begins, there's usually a procession. Various people come forward, led by a cross, with people in these kinds of robes behind them. And you're saying, what is this all about? Well, it's actually got a number of roots to it. First, you have to remember that in the ancient world, no one had watches, no one had clocks, and no one had public address systems. So in the days when the temple was still being used for worship in the Old Testament, the way that the people were gathered for worship is that a procession would begin in the town, in Jerusalem. The priests and the singers and those who carried banners would all process through the town, singing and worshiping God and gathering all the people. And as they heard this procession moving through the town, they'd all come, and then they would process into the temple and begin that time of worship. And we read about that in Psalm 68 as this procession comes forward from verse 24. And there are other places where it's mentioned as well. So there was this precedent in the ancient world of processing as a way of gathering people and collecting them together. But by the time of the Roman Empire, something else had also begun. And that was that important people, and this was not unique to Rome, but important people had someone carry their standard, their banner, in front of them, and people would bow to the symbol in honor of the emperor in particular. And what happened is that if the emperor's standard was raised, everyone had to bow. And the Christians decided we were not going to worship the emperor. It was, of course, one of the major reasons why they were persecuted. They would only bow and only acknowledge the symbol of Christ. And so it became the tradition that the gathering, the procession, was led by something like this: a cross, a crucifix. There were other symbols of Christ, the Tau Row, and various others. This is the most common one we use today. And so the procession all comes in behind Christ, and the crucifier carries the cross at the head of the procession. When he gets to the front before the altar, then everyone bows except the crucifier. So the person carrying the standard of Christ never bows while carrying the standard. And sometimes, of course, the processions are very simple, and the only processional item is the cross. Depending on how high the liturgy is, you will see often behind the cross is someone carrying a gospel book. So the gospel book is carried. It is usually ornate. Often can even be covered in gold or silver. It's never covered in leather because that's the skin of a dead animal, and the gospel is a living document. This one is a fairly simple version of a gospel book with a cross, of course, in the middle, the Alpha Omega, a symbol of Christ in the center. As we read in Revelation, there are 4 living creatures that surround the throne of God, worshiping him day and night. So each one looks like a different creature. One has the head of a man, one has the head of an ox, one has the head of a lion, and one has a head of an eagle. And so by tradition, these became the symbols of the 4 evangelists, those who had brought the gospel to the world. Of course, the evangelists are the writers of the gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew is symbolized by the man, Mark is symbolized by the lion, Luke is symbolized by the ox, and John is symbolized by the eagle. And so those are put on the gospel book, which is simply a book of the 4 gospels from the New Testament. Now, they are processed in not because the gospels are more important or more scriptural than the rest of the Bible, but as a symbol of the incarnation. This is about Christ coming, the Word becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us. And so the gospel is taken as the center of our story and as a symbol of Christ. So along with the cross as a symbol of Christ, the gospel book is a symbol of Christ. But in this case, that's the symbol of our salvation. This is a symbol of the living Word coming and dwelling amongst us.